The journey of leather begins not in the tannery, but amidst the visceral chaos of the slaughterhouse, where the air is thick with the copper tang of blood and the terrified lowing of cattle condemned to the knife. In the mid-18th century, the skinner's work is a frantic race against putrefaction, requiring a steady hand even as steam rises from the opened carcasses in the cold morning air. A master skinner knows that a single slip of his flaying knife, creating a hole or a deep score in the skin, instantly devalues the hide by half, turning a potential saddle or fine boot into mere glue stock. He works with a gruesome precision, peeling the heavy skin from the muscle and fat, often leaving the tail and horns attached as proof of the animal's identity and health. The green hide, as it is called when fresh, is a heavy, wet burden, weighing upwards of 80 pounds, slick with tallow and manure, demanding immediate attention before the inevitable decay sets in. Once removed, the hide enters a critical limbo where preservation is the only priority, especially if the tannery is days away or if the weather is unseasonably warm. In the yard, apprentices drag the steaming skins to a salting area, spreading them out hair side down to be liberally dusted with coarse rock salt or dipped in a strong brine solution if available, though salt taxes in many regions often force them to rely on rapid air drying. This drying process is fraught with risk. If dried too quickly in the sun, the outer surface hardens into a shell while the inner fibers rot, a defect known as sun-kissed that ruins the leather from within. The sensory assault of this stage is overwhelming, a mix of animal waste and iron-rich blood that clings to the clothes and skin of the workers, marking them as part of a trade that, while essential to the economy, is socially ostracized and banished to the outskirts of town. Transportation to the tannery is the final step of this raw harvest, often involving carts piled high with stiff, salted hides or wet, bloody bundles that drip onto the cobblestones. Upon arrival at the tanner's yard, usually located downstream from the city to carry away the waste, the hides are inspected with a ruthless eye by the master tanner. He looks for warble fly holes, tiny punctures caused by parasitic larvae, and brand marks that scar the grain, calculating the potential yield of the skin before a price is agreed upon. This transaction is the bridge between the butcher's abrupt violence and the tanner's slow chemical alchemy. The hides are tossed into a pile, a chaotic mound of potential waiting to be transformed. But first, they must be purged of every trace of the animal's former life, a process that begins with the simple, relentless power of water. The first true stage of the tanner's art takes place in the beam house or directly in the rushing waters of a nearby diversion stream, where the filth of the slaughter yard must be relentlessly purged. Apprentices, often young boys with chapped hands and soaked woolen trousers, spend hours dragging the heavy, stiffened hides into the water, securing them with heavy stones or iron hooks to prevent the current from carrying away their livelihood. The goal is twofold: to wash away the salt, dried blood, and dung that encrust the hair, and to rehydrate the fibers that may have glued themselves together during drying. In the winter, this is agonizing work, as the icy water numbs the fingers and the stiff hides cut like serrated edges, while in the summer, the warmer water accelerates the risk of bacteria eating into the grain before the tanning even begins. For hides that have been dried to the hardness of wood for transport, the soaking process is more aggressive and can last for days, requiring constant vigilance to ensure they soften uniformly without beginning to rot. The workers use long wooden poles with blunt metal tips to beat and manipulate the skins under the water, breaking the dried adhesion of the fibers and forcing moisture back into the collagen network. This breaking over is physically exhausting, a rhythmic drudgery that demands the worker to heave the waterlogged weight, now even heavier than when it was green. repeatedly until the skin becomes pliable and flabby, mimicking the texture it had on the living animal. The water downstream from this operation runs dark and foul, a visible testament to the pollution that defines the industry, choking fish and angering downstream neighbors with the effluent of dissolved salt and animal waste. Once the master tanner is satisfied that the hides are sufficiently soft and clean, they are hauled onto the muddy banks, a glistening, dripping mass ready for the mechanical removal of flesh. Before any chemical treatment can work, the remnants of meat and fat left by the butcher must be scraped away, a task performed over a wooden beam, a convex log inclined at a steep angle. The worker leans over the beam, pressing the wet hide against the wood with his hips, and drives a two-handled fleshing knife down the surface. The blade is dull on the edge to push rather than cut, stripping away the subcutaneous tissue in long, slimy ribbons. It is a messy, slippery job where footing is treacherous, and the air smells of wet dog and raw meat. But it is essential to expose the dermis so the tanning liquors can eventually penetrate from both sides. With the hides washed and fleshed, they are plunged into the lime pits, a series of sunken vats filled with a milky, caustic suspension of slaked lime and water that serves as a chemical gatekeeper to the tanning process. This stage, known as liming, is designed to destroy the epidermis and loosen the hair roots, while simultaneously causing the skin fibers to swell and open up, preparing them to receive the tanning agents. The yard is dominated by the acrid, choking dust of powdered lime, which irritates the lungs and burns the eyes of the workers who mix the solution using long plungers. The hides are tied together in chains or handled individually with iron tongs, lowered into the bubbling white liquid, where they will steep for weeks, moved progressively from old, mellow lime liquors to fresh, strong ones to avoid shocking the skin and drawing the grain too tight. The physical toll of the lime pits is severe. The alkaline solution is aggressive enough to dissolve human skin just as it dissolves the hair follicles of the ox. Tanners often suffer from lime holes, deep ulcerated sores on their hands and arms where the caustic fluid has eaten away the flesh, wounds that are slow to heal and prone to infection in the filthy environment of the yard. Despite the pain, the workers must haul the hides up daily to air them out and stack them on the pit edges, a practice called handling, which ensures the lime penetrates evenly and prevents the hides from heating up and liquefying in the vat. This constant lifting of 60-pound wet hides, slick with slime and corrosive fluid, develops the tanner's characteristic immense upper body strength, but also wrecks their backs and joints long before old age sets in. When the hair slips easily from the hide with a mere push of the thumb, the skins are dragged out for the unhairing process, returning once more to the wooden beam. This time, the worker uses a blunt, curved knife, pushing against the grain of the hair to scrape it off in great wet clumps, revealing the pale, clean grain surface underneath. This is a moment of revelation, where the true quality of the skin is first seen, unmasked by hair or dirt. The hair is not wasted. It is collected, washed, and sold to plasterers to bind their mortar, or to upholsterers for stuffing, ensuring that the economy of the tannery remains tight and wasteless. The hide, now swollen, rubbery, and highly alkaline, is stripped naked, a blank canvas of collagen waiting for the bizarre and foul step of baiting that will neutralize the lime and give the leather its final character. History is rarely clean. If you want to see the raw, unfiltered engineering that built the modern world without the Polish, hit that subscribe button now to join the guild. Let's get back to work. The transition from the caustic brutality of the lime pits to the delicate chemistry of tanning requires a step that is arguably the most repulsive in the entire history of manufacture: baiting or puring. To neutralize the alkalinity of the lime and reduce the swelling of the hides so they become soft and pliable rather than hard and brittle, the tanner relies on a warm fermentation of water mixed with dog dung or pigeon droppings. This mixture, known euphemistically as pure, is gathered by the poorest street scavengers who scour the cobblestones of the city, collecting the white, chalky excrement of dogs fed on bone, selling it by the bucketful to the tannery gates. The stench of the baiting room is a suffocating, ammonia-heavy miasma that clings to the workers' lungs, distinct from the rot of the slaughterhouse, a sharp, penetrating odor of warm fecal matter that never truly leaves the skin of those who tend the vats. The science, though unknown to the 18th century worker, relies on bacterial enzymes in the dung to digest the elastin fibers and dissolve the remaining lime salts deep within the skin's matrix. The master tanner must monitor this process with obsessive care, often using his own sense of taste or touch to judge the strength of the foul liquor, knowing that the line between a perfectly baited hide and a ruined, dissolved gelatinous mess is a matter of hours. The hides are paddled in this warm, disgusting broth until they fall, losing their rubbery, swollen stiffness to become as soft and slippery as wet silk. It is a nervous time, for if the fermentation runs too hot or too long, the grain will be pricked, riddled with tiny pinholes caused by bacterial colonies eating into the valuable surface, rendering the leather useless for fine goods. Once the master signals that the bait has done its work, the hides are hauled out and subjected to scudding, a final, meticulous cleaning over the beam before the actual tanning begins. Using a slate or a double-handled knife with a fine edge, the worker presses out the remaining filth, dark pigments, and dissolved lime salts from the pores of the skin. A murky gray slime, known as scud, is squeezed out under the pressure of the blade, leaving the pelt essentially pure, white, and chemically neutral. This is the last moment the skin is vulnerable to putrefaction. It is now a clean, open network of fibers, hungry to absorb the vegetable tannins that will preserve it for centuries. But for now, it is fragile, slippery, and utterly dependent on the next stage to survive. While the beamhouse workers wrestle with wet skins, the yard's dry side is dominated by the thunderous groaning of the bark mill, the heart of the tannery's supply chain. The primary agent of preservation is tannin, derived almost exclusively in this era from the bark of oak trees, which must be harvested in a specific window of spring when the sap is rising and the bark peels easily from the timber. The tanner purchases vast ricks of this bark from foresters, stacking it in long, dry sheds like precious firewood, for without it, his pits are nothing but holes of stagnant water. The preparation of the tanning material is a loud, dusty, and explosive, violent affair, contrasting sharply with the wet silence of the pits, as the dried strips of bark must be pulverized into a coarse powder to release their astringent power. The grinding is typically performed by a large stone wheel, edged with iron teeth, rolling around a circular trough, driven by a weary, blindfolded horse plodding in endless circles, or in larger operations, by a water wheel connected to a system of wooden gears. The air in the mill shed is thick with a reddish-brown dust that coats the lungs and creates a permanent dry cough among the millers, a stark trade-off for the damp rheumatism of the pit men. This dust is not merely waste, it is the tan, and the consistency of the grind is debated endlessly. Too fine, and it clogs the pits, preventing the liquor from circulating. Too coarse, and the tannins leach out too slowly, extending an already agonizingly long process. The noise is deafening, a rhythmic crushing sound that vibrates through the floorboards, marking the tempo of production for the entire facility. The ground bark is not applied directly to the skins immediately, but is often leached in steeping pits to create ooze, or tanning liquor of varying strengths. The tanner acts as a chef of astringency, managing a complex battery of liquors ranging from near-water weakness to dark, syrup-thick infusions. He must calculate the reserves of bark against the intake of hides, ensuring he never runs out of strong liquor in the winter months when bark cannot be harvested. The sheer volume of material required is staggering. It takes roughly 4 to 5 pounds of oak bark to produce a single pound of finished leather, meaning the physical footprint of the bark stacks often dwarfs the tannery itself. A visual reminder that this industry is as much about forestry management as it is about animal processing. The actual conversion of perishable skin into rot-proof leather occurs in the tan pits, a grid of sunken wooden or clay-lined vats that define the landscape of the yard. The process begins in the handlers, a series of pits containing weak, nearly spent liquor, where the hides are introduced gently to the tannin. If a raw, white hide were thrown immediately into strong liquor, the surface fibers would tan instantly, shrinking and hardening into a barrier that prevents the tannin from reaching the center. A catastrophic error known as case hardening. To avoid this, apprentices spend their days moving the hides from one weak pit to a slightly stronger one, handling them constantly to ensure even color and absorption. It is here that the skins begin to lose their ghostly white pallor, slowly turning a pale biscuit color as the oak tannins bind chemically with the collagen proteins. As the weeks turn into months, the hides graduate to the layers or layaways, deep pits, where the true, deep tanning takes place in a state of anaerobic stillness. Here, the work shifts from constant agitation to heavy lifting and patience. The workers descend into the empty pits and lay the hides out flat, shoveling a thick layer of ground oak bark between each skin like the filling of a grotesque sandwich, until the pit is filled to the brim. Strong tanning liquor is then pumped or baled in to flood the pit, creating a dark, submerged tomb where the hides will rest undisturbed. The weight of the stack presses the bark into the pores of the leather, forcing the tannin deep into the fiber structure through osmosis, a process that cannot be rushed by any human hand. This phase is the test of a tanner's capital and nerves, for the hides must remain in these layers for anywhere from 12 to 18 months, sometimes even 2 years for heavy sole leather. During this time, the money invested in the skins and bark is effectively buried in the ground, yielding no return until the cycle is complete. Periodically, the pits are drained, and the hides hauled up to be relayered with fresh bark and stronger liquor, a back-breaking harvest of heavy, dripping slabs that have now turned a rich, dark russet brown. The master tanner checks progress not by a clock, but by slicing a small strip from the edge of a hide. If he sees a white line in the center, the raw streak, the leather is not yet done, and back into the dark ooze it must go, governed entirely by the slow, natural diffusion of the oak into the beast. Once the leather is lifted from the pits, dark and saturated with tannin, it is technically preserved, but it is far from usable. It is a stiff, rough slab that would crack if bent and chafe the skin of any wearer. The task of transforming this rigid material into supple, waterproof leather belongs to the currier, a craftsman often legally and guild-separated from the tanner to prevent monopolies. The wet hides are scoured to remove the last of the pit bloom, a white deposit of ellagic acid, and then draped over a vertical beam for the delicate operation of shaving. The currier uses a rectangular, two-handled knife with a turned edge, a blade so distinct and difficult to sharpen that maintaining it is a trade secret in itself. With this tool, he shaves the flesh side of the leather to a uniform thickness, slicing away impossibly thin shavings to level the hide. correcting nature's inconsistencies where the skin was thicker at the neck or butt. After shaving, the leather is ready for stuffing, the vital infusion of oils that will lubricate the fibers and allow them to slide over one another, granting flexibility. The currier prepares a hot, nauseating mixture of tallow, rendered animal fat, and cod liver oil, known as dubbin, which he scours into the wet leather with a stone or a heavy brush. This is not a gentle application. The grease must be driven deep into the pores while the water is evaporating. A chemical race where the oil replaces the moisture in the fiber network. The workshop floor becomes a skating rink of black grease, and the currier's arms are coated to the elbow in the dark, fishy sludge. It is physically demanding work, requiring the craftsman to pummel and knead the leather, working the grain to ensure the grease penetrates evenly, preventing the leather from drying out into a hard board. For leather destined for the uppers of boots or fine harnesses, the currier performs boarding, folding the leather grain to grain and rolling it under a cork-surfaced board strapped to his arm. This constant crushing and bending breaks up the stiffness of the fiber bundles and brings up the grain pattern, the pebbled texture that defines fine leather. It is a rhythmic, squeaking labor that creates the characteristic creaking sound of new leather. The currier acts as the final sculptor of the material, deciding whether a hide becomes the rock-hard sole of a soldier's boot or the pliable, soft vamp of a gentleman's riding shoe, manipulating the density and oil content with intuition born of decades of tactile experience. The final drying of the leather is not a passive act of leaving skins in the sun, but a strictly controlled architectural function performed in the drying lofts. Long, barn-like structures with louvered wooden slats instead of windows. These slats, known as louvers, allow the master tanner to manipulate the airflow through the building with the precision of a sailor trimming sails. If the wind is too strong or the air too dry, the surface of the leather will dehydrate rapidly while the center remains wet, causing the grain to crack and the fibers to tear under tension. If the air is stagnant and damp, the dreaded mold will bloom on the valuable skins within 24 hours, ruining the finish with indelible spots. Apprentices run up and down the ladders, opening and closing the boards to chase the sun and wind, treating the drying shed as a living lung that must breathe at a specific tempo. Inside the twilight of the loft, the hides are hung over poles or tacked onto wooden straining frames to dry under tension, which maximizes the surface area, essential for selling by the square foot, and prevents the leather from shrinking into a distorted shape. As the leather dries, it goes through the stage of samming, a semi-dry state where it is damp but not wet, the perfect condition for final manipulations. For sole leather, this involves the rolling machine or a heavy brass roller pushed by hand, compressing the fibers into a dense, impenetrable shield that can withstand the abrasion of cobblestones. The sound in the loft is a heavy, thumping rhythm as the rollers compress the leather against zinc or hardwood beds, polishing the grain to a smooth, shiny finish without the use of varnishes. This stage is also where the cosmetic defects of the animal's life are hidden or highlighted. A glassing jack, a tool with a smooth glass cylinder, is rubbed over the grain with immense pressure to glaze the surface, generating heat through friction that darkens and polishes the natural oils. The tanner must constantly inspect the hanging inventory, rotating skins from the cooler, darker corners to the brighter, airier center to ensure uniformity. A sudden storm or a spike in humidity can force the entire crew to scramble, sealing the loft tight to protect the investment. The drying loft is the silent, anxious finale to the process, where the water that started the journey in the beam house is finally exorcised, leaving behind a material that is essentially mummified skin, stable, and unchanging. The cycle concludes when the finished leather leaves the tannery gates, bound for the leather halls or local fairs where the trade is regulated and taxed. Before a single hide can be sold to a shoemaker, saddler, or bookbinder, it must often pass the inspection of the searchers and sealers of the Leather Guild. These officials, armed with stamps and knives, test the quality of the tanning. If they find the leather was tanned too quickly, or if the hide is spongy and under-tanned in the center, they have the authority to slash the hide to ribbons or confiscate it, publicly shaming the tanner. The stamp of the guild is the guarantee of the process, a mark that certifies the leather has spent its full sentence in the oak ooze and has been finished with honest fat and oil. The marketplace itself is overwhelmed by the smell, a rich, complex aroma of oak, tallow, and cured skin that defines the sensory landscape of the pre-industrial city, just as much as smoke or sewage. Leather is the plastic of the 18th century. It is everywhere, in the buckets of the fire brigade, the hoses of the pumps, the springs of the coaches, the hinges of the doors, and the aprons of the blacksmiths. The tanner's product is the literal connective tissue of society, holding together the machinery of war, transport, and industry. The hides that were once dragging on the slaughterhouse floor, wet and corruptible, are now stacked in neat, fragrant piles, graded by weight and quality, ready to be cut and stitched into objects that will likely outlive the cattle, the tanner, and the buyer. The tanner walks away with his hands permanently stained black by the reaction of oak tannin and iron, his pockets heavy with coin, but his social standing essentially fixed as a man of the trade. Wealthy, perhaps, but forever associated with the stench of his profession. The process he oversees is a loop of destruction and resurrection, taking the waste of death and, through rot, acid, and labor, forging it into the most durable material known to man. As the cart rolls away with the season's production, the yard does not rest. The next load of green hides is already arriving from the butchers. The lime pits are being stirred, and the grind of the bark mill begins again. A relentless engine of transformation that feeds the insatiable hunger of an expanding world. In a world of instant gratification and disposable goods, the tanner teaches us that true resilience can only be forged through patience and grit. If you believe these forgotten stories of craftsmanship deserve to be remembered, help us keep the past alive. Subscribe to the channel, share this history with a friend, and tell us in the comments which trade we should uncover next.